On the wall next to a large Buddha statue in the temple, there are paintings of various gods. A baseball player in his uniform quietly gazes up at them, looking somehow full of hope. This man is the hero of our story. Someone calls out, "Day," and he turns around. It's a monk. The monk asks if he's heading to his game. Dan nods his head and says yes. Today's the championship game. The monk grins and teases him, saying that if he loses, he should just shave his head and become a monk. Da honestly can't tell if the monk is cheering him on or just trying to recruit him. Suddenly, someone runs in, calling him Appa. A half-asleep teenage girl appears, brushing her teeth. As she walks, she squints her eyes and asks him if he's leaving already. Da looks puzzled and asks her why she's awake so early. She tells him to hold out his hand, and into his palm, she drops a small keychain. Da looks at it. Completely baffled, annoyed, she explains, "That's obviously a cute doll. It's a small blue bear with white horns, dark eyebrows, and tiny, sharp little fangs." What? She wasn't sure if cute was the right word for it, and that thought only served to irritate her more. She quickly apologizes, admitting she's not very good with her hands. She tells him to just think of it as a good luck charm or something. When asked if she made it herself, she immediately gets flustered by the question. He thanks her and promises to cherish it. And then, he pats her on the head, teasing her for suddenly being so thoughtful. She immediately snaps that she hasn't even washed her hair yet. Dan recoils, yelling that his hand is going to rot off. He even asks the monk to purify it for him. She kicks him and tells him to just hurry up and go already. Their little squabble is honestly hilarious. But then the monk again calls out Dan's name. Both of them freeze. The monk quietly tells Dan to come back safely today as well. Dan just smiles, reassuring him not to worry. He promises to come back with a spectacular win. The monk believes in him. After all, Dan will return victorious. At the stadium, the announcer's voice echoed throughout the entire field. It was the bottom of the ninth with 2 outs, and the score was tied. The team that wins this game becomes the champion of the high school baseball tournament. Everyone wondered if Gyeongdong High could overcome this crisis, watching with bated breath. The player stepping up to the plate was Kim Dan. He gripped the bat tightly. The announcer reminded the crowd that Kim Dan was a special player. People were already calling him the best baseball prospect in Korea. The pitcher began his windup. Between the players, the tension was so that you could cut it with a knife. The first ball left the pitcher's hand and flew through the air. The ball shot forward with ferocious speed. Dan prepared for a different swing and let it fly. He made perfect contact with the bat. The ball flew past the pitcher. It all happened in the blink of an eye. The ball soared higher and higher. A glove reached out and caught the ball, but it wasn't a player. It was someone in the stands. The stadium erupted in cheers. A home run. Kim Dan did it. The announcer shouted that Dan was a truly incredible player. Watching him, the announcer was even reminded of his own time playing as a pro in America. And with that final hit, Sangdong High defeated Gyeongdong High to claim the championship. That night, they had even prepared an exclusive interview with the star player. After winning the high school tournament, Dan was certain of one thing. In the upcoming draft, his chances were completely shot. But he had one small regret. On the way back, he'd forgotten to buy rice cakes. But then again, the monk was pretty old now. Would it even be okay for him to eat rice cakes? But honestly, I'm the one who won. Shouldn't they be the ones buying me chicken? Suddenly why? He got smacked on the back of the head. It was his little sister. She knew that he was walking slower than a snail, then asked what he was thinking about so seriously. Unfortunately for Dan, his peaceful victory stroll had just turned into interrogation time with his sister. He was stunned. He told her to stick her head out. She stuck out her tongue and threatened to tell the monk on him if he hit her. So he switched tactics. He started teasing her instead, asking if she'd even washed her hair. She immediately yelled back that she did. They continued walking together. She told him that during class, her school had put on his baseball game. And when her big brother hit that home run, every single classroom screamed, "Toad." That the school started getting noise complaints. Dan puffed out his chest with pride, Odell, puffing his chest out and saying that was a given. After all, an unparalleled genius had appeared in Korea. She rolled her eyes, saying it was all thanks to the lucky charm she gave him. With a very sarcastic tone, he replied politely. She immediately said that in that case, next time, he would have to buy her something. He said he was already hungry, so they should hurry home and get something to eat. And since he was the one who won the game, he expected her to do the dishes tonight. She complained, asking what doing the dishes had to do with baseball when they arrived. At the temple, he pushed the door open and shouted loudly, "We're home," but through the small crack he saw something strange. He saw that the monk had collapsed on the floor, and in front of him stood a man, wearing a red cloak. He bent down to get a better look. At the same time, his little sister froze, pushing the door open wider. She asked why he wasn't going in. And then she saw it, too. Her face turned pale as she screamed the monk's name. His heart sank. The man calmly said it had nothing to do with him, but he didn't believe a single word. He rushed forward and swung his bat at the man, but the man easily dodged the attack. And then saw it. He turned his gaze to Dan. He yelled for Kanina to run. She hesitated, terribly worried about Dan, but he yelled once more, telling her to hurry. Tears streamed down her face. And finally, she started to run. Dan's mind raced. Who was this man, and why was he here? Most importantly, what happened to the monk? He prayed that the old monk still hadn't passed away. There was only one thing to do right now. First, he had to take that man down. Still, there was one piece of good luck. The intruder didn't seem to be carrying a weapon. The man calmly said he wanted to explain everything, but unfortunately, there wasn't much time left. He apologized for how things had turned out this way. Then he pulled out a crystal. It suddenly began to shine with a brilliant light. Dan's eyes widened in shock. In the blink of an eye, the man was gone. The next moment, he had already closed the distance and struck Dan. Before Dan could even react, the man pressed the glowing crystal against his chest. And then he called Dan's name. He told him to find Enya. As he looked closer, Dan realized the man's face was identical to his own. He froze. In that moment, suddenly, from under his feet, the ground seemed to shatter, and Dan began to fall. He was utterly confused. The earth was crumbling away, and his body just kept blending into the darkness. He tried to speak, but no sound came out. His consciousness slowly began to fade, but he fought it with everything he had. Enya and the monk were still behind him. Right now, he couldn't afford to pass out. When he opened his eyes again, the sight before him, it made his blood run cold. A skull was lying on the ground. And inside that skull was it was squirming. I screamed. The ghastly skull was so creepy. It gave me goosebumps. Why is something like this here? More importantly, where on earth am I? It seemed to fall into some kind of strange cave. His hand brushed against something nearby. When he looked down, his heart almost stopped. It was an egg. And inside the egg, a centipede was writhing. Another wave of terror washed over him. And then he looked around. Eggs were scattered everywhere. Suddenly, that one egg over there cracked. From the shell, one leg slowly pushed its way out, followed by the rest of it. Its pie crawled out. It had multiple legs and a mouth filled with sharp teeth. The spider started crawling straight towards him, and around him, other eggs also began to hatch. Frozen in absolute terror, he could no longer process what was happening. The creature suddenly lunged and sank its fangs into his shoulder. The numb spread through his veins. He screamed again, shaking the spider off. He groaned as a burning pain seared through his arm. What the hell are these things? More of the bugs started crawling toward him. Fortunately, his bat had also fallen nearby. He quickly snatched it and swung it to drive the creatures away, but he knew he couldn't fight off so many at once. He had to get out of there first. He ran as fast as he could, while the other bugs gave chase. He had no idea where he was, but he just kept running. He had to find a place to hide. The bugs were fast. Terrifyingly fast. That's when he finally realized. He was inside a gigantic cave. As the bugs drew closer, his eyes widened. He had no other choice. He leaped into the lake, splashing deep into the water. His head shot back up above the surface. When the bugs stopped at the water's edge, he felt a wave of relief. They couldn't enter the water. But just then, a sharp pain shot through his leg. A few wriggling bugs were latched onto him. He quickly scrambled to the shore and tore them off his leg. They were leeches. He sighed in frustration. And the monsters were literally everywhere. And now, he was seriously starting to wonder just where in the world he had ended up. He'd spent his whole life playing baseball, but he'd never seen or heard of anything like this. He began to question if he was even in the same world anymore. His hand suddenly brushed against something soft. To his surprise, it was the good luck charm from his little sister. It was now worn out, missing its right eye and one of its horns. He wondered how it even got there. Frowning. It must have been in my pocket this whole time. Then, his thoughts drifted to that day. He also wondered if the monk was safe. Of course I dare that bastard who had the guts to charge at them. It remembered him, but if forcefully stop those thoughts. Panicking wouldn't solve a thing. He took a deep breath and tried to get a grip. Right now, the best thing he could do was act. There had to be an exit. Now that he was a bit calmer, he decided to check his surroundings. Without him even knowing, a creature was already right behind him. He only noticed it when its toxic saliva dripped onto his bat, and that's when he realized. Monster was right there. He froze. The spider suddenly attacked, and to dodge it, he had to throw himself to the ground. He quickly rolled and turned, barely managing to see what was chasing him. He knew one thing for sure. He had to run. Luckily, he quickly spotted something important. He saw a narrow crevice in the cave wall. He sprinted towards it. Almost there. The small entrance was right in front of him, but the spider's leg was just a few inches away. It almost got him. Thankfully, he managed to squeeze inside, and the spider was too big to follow. But he had relaxed too soon. The creature shoved one of its legs through the crevice, jamming it between his feet. It was trying to drag him out. Thankfully, he wasn't hurt. Dai trembled, looking at the monster's mouth, which was filled with sharp teeth. After a moment, the spider finally retreated and crawled away. Dai couldn't stop trembling. For a second there, he really thought he was going to die. That's when he noticed something strange. His arm had turned purple, and the veins were bulging beneath his skin. He realized it must have been the poison from that bug. To make matters worse, as if things weren't bad enough, he couldn't even feel his arm anymore. His life was hanging by a thread, and now his arm was practically useless. Still, he couldn't just hide in there forever. Dai slowly peeked out of the crevice. He scanned the cave, trying to figure out what to do next. That's when he spotted a faint light and the silhouette of a person standing in front of it. Dai immediately called out to them. He screamed that he was over here. A wave of relief washed over his chest. He thought he was completely alone in this place. But as the person drew closer, Dai finally saw their face, and what he saw made his blood run cold. It was then he saw that it was a skull, with a spider on its head. The moment he realized it wasn't a person at all, but another monster. He froze. It then tried to bite him. Luckily, he managed to dodge. As the skull fell forward, he finally got a clear look at the spider. Its tail, like legs were controlling the body, plunged straight into the cranium, like some kind of parasite. He gripped his bat tightly. He figured if he just smashed whatever that thing was, it would die. But to his shock, instead his bat snapped in half. The enraged bug turned to face him. The skull lunged forward and bit down on his shoulder. He groaned in pain. He tried to push it off. He took the handle of the broken bat, shoved it into its mouth, and pushed back. The creature shook the bat loose and lunged at him again. As it grabbed his face, he froze in terror. It tried to bite his head off, but he blocked it with his arm. It bit his arm instead. He cried out in pain. With his other hand, he scrambled to find anything on the ground. He grabbed a rock, and with it, he smashed the skull. The skeleton collapsed to the ground. And then, to finish it off, he lunged forward. He kept smashing it with a rock. A cracking sound echoed through the cave, as the parasite-infested skull shattered into pieces. He was completely exhausted. But the moment he was done, more monsters appeared. By this point, he had a look of complete annoyance on his face. From the darkness, various different monsters crawled out. Every single undead had a parasite attached to its skull. It made him want to see just how far his rage would take him. He started to run. As the monsters rushed at him, he charged forward as well. He smashed his fists into the monsters. A skeletal dog monster bit into his calf. He gritted his teeth in pain. He fought back, slamming his elbow. It was fatal, but there were more. A humanoid undead leaped at him. It slammed him to the ground and tried to bite his face off. Thankfully, he pushed it away before the others could reach him. From somewhere, he heard an amused voice. His eyes widened. He glanced toward where the voice came from and saw that it was his lucky charm that was talking. He stared in disbelief. He stared at the small doll. And he couldn't believe, but it was talking. For a moment, he wondered if he'd finally gone insane. He asked what it was. The doll turned into a mist. It calmly said that it didn't matter, because he was about to die anyway. It told him that if he grabbed it, he could live. He asked what it meant. Just then, time seemed to slow down. The voice urged him to hurry, because monsters were coming. It urged him to hurry. With monsters right behind him, he ran toward the blue flame as fast as he could. He was almost there. A monster nearly his hand reached the misty tall first, and a bright light exploded. The light kept the monsters from getting any closer to him. He found himself holding the mist in his hand. His eyes blazed with a blue flame. At first, he didn't understand the weapon forming in his hand, but it slowly took the shape of a baseball bat. He was a little disappointed. With all things, a baseball bat. A monster shrieked sharply and lunged at him. His rage finally exploded. He swung the bat with all his might. The impact caused the monster's body to shatter into pieces. He blinked, shocked by what had just happened. On the ground, only the monster's legs remained. He felt strength surging through his entire body. It was probably because of the bat. What was happening? Where this place was? What the bat really was? Why he had to go through all this? He didn't know a single thing, but with this in his hands, he felt like he could fight back. Nothing else mattered anymore. From now on, he would just smash every last one of those bastards and survive. The bodies of monsters were scattered everywhere, most of them torn to shreds. And by that point, he was already breathing in ragged gasps. He couldn't believe what had just happened. His bat was extraordinary. He could feel power flowing through his body. He wondered if this was some kind of magic, but then the bat suddenly turned into mist. He stared at it, completely stunned. The mist gathered and formed something like a bizarre creature. Honestly, the sight of it scared him. And soon, it started moving toward the monster corpses. He had no idea what he was even. It was impossible to tell if it was watching. That creature began to devour the monsters. It floated around, swallowing every last corpse, one by one, and when it was finished, it began to glow brightly. Then, it returned to his hand. It had turned back into a baseball bat. And then suddenly, his chest tightened. The boy experienced the most excruciating pain he had ever felt in his entire life. He crumbles in agony. He had no idea why this sudden wave of pain was hitting him. That's when he noticed something strange was happening to his body. The wound on his arm had vanished, and it wasn't just his arm. Even the smallest scratches were gone. Everything had healed in an instant, and somehow, he felt stronger. He wondered if this was the power of the bat. He thought it was truly incredible. With this, he might actually be able to survive. But just then, his stomach let out a loud growl. He was starving. That's when he spotted some glowing mushrooms nearby. He stared at the mushrooms, lost in thought for a long moment. Right now, they were the only thing he could eat, but the monsters here were dangerous. These mushrooms, they could be poisonous. But he made his decision. He was going to eat them. Rather than slowly starving to death, it was better to risk being poisoned. Denny took a bite, and his eyes widened in surprise. They were actually delicious. The gamble was a huge success. Of course, even though he'd regained some strength, it wouldn't have been surprising if he'd gotten sick at any moment. For now, he was just relieved that he'd solved his food problem. After that, he went to a puddle. There were leeches inside, but at least he could drink from it. Still, it was a disgusting feeling. In fact, while it wouldn't have been strange for him to fall ill at any moment, perhaps thanks to the influence of a bet, he was almost completely unharmed. Even the brutal survival in the cave became somewhat bearable thanks to that mysterious power. Just as he was starting to adapt to life in the cave, the constant flood of monsters reminded him that this was not the world he used to live in. Those bugs, which seemed to live as parasites on the corpses of other creatures, had hard shells, but their weak spots were easy to hit. Taking them down wasn't particularly hard, but that was all thanks to Bet. Whenever he killed a monster, Bet would devour its remains, and when it returned to him, his body would be healed and grow even stronger. In that way, and so, in this hellish place, he slowly began to adapt, little by little, regaining hope and the confidence that he could survive. He was getting it all back. That is, until he ran into someone else. In this dark place, countless dangers were lurking. But the most dangerous of them all was, without a doubt, that giant monster. Fortunately, that thing, it only seemed to wander around its nest from time to time. Other than that, it didn't seem to show any other signs of movement. While avoiding it, he wandered through the cave for a long time, but he couldn't find an exit anywhere. In the end, he came to one conclusion. It had to be in the nest where he first started, on the complete opposite side. It just had to be. The problem was, even if he could deal with the bugs and smaller monsters, he would have to pass through that hellish place to get there. He wondered, could he really get past that colossal monster? He had his doubts. On top of that, he wondered if he could ever return to where his family was. He just didn't know. At the thought that he might be trapped in that hell forever, his spirits sank. He also wondered, just how did he end up falling into this place, and about that man from earlier, the one in the cloak. He wondered why the man looked exactly like him. He remembered that the man had told him to find something. He experimented with those painful thoughts, but after a moment, he stopped. Just thinking about it wasn't going to help him survive. So, he decided to focus on getting out of there. He kept walking through the cave, until he reached the place where it all began. The bugs were still crawling out from below. He carefully scanned his surroundings, and realized the giant monster was gone. There were only small fry, and they weren't particularly agitated. He believed he could make it. As he stepped on a bone, it shattered with a loud crack. The sound made him freeze. He slowly turned his head. When nothing appeared, he let out a sigh of relief. He guessed the monster hadn't hurt him. He was trembling like a leaf, but he still managed to reach the other side safely. He was on his way out of this place, so he kept moving, hoping he could soon put all of this behind him. He finally reached a place with a large hole in the ceiling, where light was pouring in. He reached a section of the cave. Eggs were scattered around that area, too. He couldn't see a clear path out, and thought it was a dead end, but the light seemed to be coming from outside. He was thinking about climbing up there, but then he stepped on something, and the sound startled him. After the loud noise, he slowly glanced down. Unfortunately, he was standing right on the body of a giant monster, and he had just caught its attention. The giant monster attacked, slamming him to the ground. The impact made him spit up blood. It hurt like hell. He cursed inwardly. Just then, he realized something. This place, it was the giant monster's nest. The creature charged at him, ready to devour him. As he tried to get up, a spine-chilling fear washed over him. He quickly raised his bat. He swung with all his might to keep the monster from getting any closer, and the bat slammed right into the monster's leg. Green blood splattered everywhere. For a moment, he felt a surge of pride. This was a completely different feeling from his first battle. The giant monster was clearly not happy about that. It lunged again, but this time he could read the thing's movements. He had always trusted his kinetic vision. But this monster, it was on a whole other level. He blocked the attacking leg. The giant monster let out a piercing shriek. He cautiously kept his eyes on the other one. Seeing the gash on its leg, he felt a wave of relief. The attack had worked. He now knew something crucial. He could win this. The monster suddenly opened its mouth, letting out a terrifying roar. Ban's face turned pale. The ground began to shake. Small, spider-like insects rushed toward them. There were so many of them. They almost looked like a single, giant creature. Dad could only think one thing. This was completely unfair. He gripped his bat tightly and smashed the spider-like insects, sending them flying. He glanced back and swatted away more of the creatures that were sneaking up from behind. One of the bugs was flipped over. Before he knew it, Joe was gasping for air. And though the ground around him was littered with creatures' corpses, from beside the giant monster, more and more of the smaller creatures kept crawling out. It seemed endless. Something suddenly moved with blinding speed. Dan's eyes widened in shock. The next moment, the monster's leg smashed right through his chest. He gritted his teeth, enduring the agony. He struggled desperately to get free. A pained groan escaped his lips. He was still gripping the bat tightly. Then, to break free, he smashed at the leg with all his might. As the leg tore away, the monster let out a sharp scream. At last, the leg embedded in his chest was gone, but he was bleeding heavily from another wound. He looked terrible. And in front of him, there were still countless monsters. His vision started to blur. Was it because he'd lost so much blood? He wondered as he began to feel dizzy. He thought this was his limit. At this rate, there was no way he could win. He knew there was nothing more he could do. What on earth was he supposed to do now? Suddenly, he heard someone's voice, telling him to fight. When he lifted his head, he saw Ganna. She told him not to even think about giving up here. He tried to ask something, but she cut him off and told him to get up. She said that she and the mom were waiting for him. She urged him to hurry up and fight. Her words snapped him back to his senses. He turned and reached his hand toward the baseball bat. As the small creatures charged at him, he moved in a flash. The being inside the baseball bat revealed itself as a mist-like form, glowing brightly. Its face covered the right side of his own. It was now, bugs are just so affecting, he muttered. He stepped forward to face the giant bug. He charged at the creature. As he ran, a turquoise mist followed behind him. He gripped the baseball bat with both hands and swung with all his might. With that single blow, one of the monster's arms was hacked clean off. After that, the right side of his face returned to normal, and the giant monster collapsed. Debris fell from the ceiling. Sunlight pouring in from a hole illuminated the dismembered corpse, and he wondered how he had suddenly become so strong. Finally, he was able to get out of there. His bat turned back into a mist. He was surprised, but figured it was about to eat the corpse again. Watching it feed filled him with disgust. No matter how many times he saw it, he could never get used to it. When it was finished, the mist circled around him. He was shocked when it suddenly shot into his body. He gripped his shoulder tightly, and soon after, his wound healed. The healing was a relief, but he still couldn't get used to the pain. And more importantly, there was the new power he now possessed. He was different. It was nothing like absorbing monsters. He realized this was on a whole other level. The stronger his opponent, the more his would grow. That's what he began to think. His expression turned serious. He didn't know what was waiting for him outside the cave. But with this power, he believed he could handle anything. When he stepped outside, he was shocked by the scene before him. It was a desert. It wasn't exactly a great place, but it was a heck of a lot better than that damn cave. A few minutes later, he collapsed to his knees. His lips were parched and cracked. He quickly realized how wrong he'd been. This place was far more desolate than he ever imagined. There was no food, no water to drink. The only things he occasionally ran into were walking skeletons. But even that didn't surprise him anymore. To think he fought so hard to survive, only to starve to death in the end. Completely drained, he collapsed onto the ground. There wasn't a single soul inside. The only human-like things around were monsters. He started to wonder if this was a world where humanity had already gone extinct. He closed his eyes, praying that when he opened them again, this would all be a dream. Suddenly, someone yelled, "There's a person here." The sound jolted him awake. A middle-aged man told the fox hybrid girl, Chloe, not to get close to Dan. She replied that he was still alive. Dan was shocked. A moment later, Chloe was looking annoyed. As for Dan, he was sobbing his eyes out. She told him to stop crying. But he couldn't bring himself to stop. He was so relieved to finally meet them. They were the first people he'd seen since he got here. And they could actually talk to him. He was crying so pathetically. Honestly, it was quite the embarrassing sight. The man told him to calm down so they could talk. With how far they still had to go, Chloe couldn't believe he was suggesting such a thing. He told her to look at how overjoyed the guy was. They couldn't just ignore him. Besides, she was the one who saw he was alive and ran over to him first. At that, she blushed. In the end, she agreed with him. He told her she had made the right choice. They set up camp and cooked food. Over a campfire, an incredible smell was coming from the pot. Dan stared at it intensely. It was because it had been so long since he'd seen real food. Chloe remarked that he was acting like someone who had been starved for days. For over 5 days, he replied that he hadn't eaten a thing. When she heard this, she was shocked. She asked him how it was possible to last that long. He said he wasn't sure, but he thought it was because he absorbed the monsters. The man said it sounded like a kind of magic he never heard of before. He was surprised that magic even existed in this world. Chloe found it hard to believe. She asked him where on earth he came from. He confessed that he didn't know where to even begin explaining. The man told him to eat first. He said that after he finished his meal, or rather while he was eating, he would listen to his story. They learned that he came from another world, and had simply woken up there, with no other memories. And every time he killed a monster with his blunt weapon, his body would heal, and grow stronger. They thought that it was a very bizarre ability. That night, Chloe noticed that the undead were unusually quiet. He said that he had taken care of all of them with his bat. Chloe was shocked to hear him say that. But inwardly, the man knew an important fact. The undead in that place usually numbered in the, even when you destroyed them every night, they were resurrected. But the undead that Dan had absorbed didn't even stir when night fell. He wondered if there was something special about that strange weapon of his. He observed Dan quietly. Then he told Dan that, thanks to him, for the first time in a long time, he might actually be able to get some proper sleep. He proposed that if Dan didn't have a set destination, he should travel with them. He even offered to help him find a way to return to his original world. Oh, couldn't believe what Ariel had just said. Ariel looked Dan straight in the eye. Dan met his gaze and after a moment, said he would gratefully accept. All Chloe could do was sigh. The next day, she was out collecting cacti. She placed them carefully into a small pouch. She'd learned from Dan that they were, in fact, edible. He praised her, telling her she was doing a great job. She replied that it was just basic knowledge for surviving in such a harsh desert. Dan looked at her with an annoyed grin on his face. She asked him why he was staring at her like that. He said that she reminded him of his little sister. Chloe retorted that she was a full-grown adult. And so, Dan and Chloe, he joined Ars's party. As they walked, they chatted for a bit. He asked Chloe if Ki was real. In return, she asked if people from his world didn't have it. He said they didn't. As he traveled with them, he slowly began to learn many things about this world. From Chloe, who introduced herself as a beastskin, he learned common sense and knowledge needed for survival. She asked what kind of races lived in his world. He answered that there were only humans. Hearing that, she said it sounded boring. When she caught up with Ars, she ran over to him. From the middle-aged man named Ars, he learned about the habits of different monsters and how to fight them. The two of them also told him they had come there to defeat that monster leader. I felt incredibly lucky. Although I still didn't know much about the people of this world, I knew one thing for sure. I had met some really good people. Late that night, he clutched a lucky charm in his hand. He couldn't stop thinking. Ars asked him, "Can't sleep?" It seemed he had come to check on him. He admitted he had a lot on his mind. Ars's hometown. Asking if he was thinking about it, and said he was curious too. After all, he had lived in this world for a long time, but Dale was the first person from another world he had ever met. Joe replied that compared to this world, his own world was pretty boring. Ars concluded that it must be a very peaceful world that could do nothing but smile. He suddenly realized how peaceful his old home had been. A life he once thought was miserable would be considered a luxury in this world. He even started talking to Ars about baseball. Dad became firmly determined to do whatever it took to go back. The next day, a giant dragon-like monster was chasing them. Dying was definitely not in his plans. Then and Chloe ran. He told her to go on ahead. She was worried about him, but he insisted that she hurry. He gripped his baseball bat tightly and slammed it into the dragon's face. The blow made it hard for the dragon to open its right eye. Ed put everything he had into that attack. The dragon was furious. As it charged at him, he let out a loud yell. He screamed. He was sent flying. In its explosion, Chloe turned around. Din was writhing in agony. He glared at the monster. The dragon, intending to devour him, charged straight at him. Suddenly, the giant monster was split open from its mouth, all the way down to its torso. Then, the monster collapsed to the ground. It was Ars's doing. He asked Dan if he was alright. Chloe, on the other hand, immediately scolded him for being late. She then asked Dan if he was hurt anywhere. Dan said it was nothing serious. His baseball bat began to glow. A creature emerged from it and started to devour the monster. Dan and Chloe's eyes widened in shock. Just then, Dan's wounds began to heal. And soon, he looked perfectly fine again. Chloe asked what that thing was. She asked if that was the absorption he had mentioned before. Dan said that was basically it. Ars watched as the corpse and the creature vanished without a trace. Dan and Chloe were cheerfully talking about what had just happened. But Ars looked grim. In a stern voice, he called out Dan's name and said he had a job for him. Dan and Chloe listened intently. Late that night, Chloe screamed at him, asking if he was crazy, but Ars was completely serious. She was furious that he was basically telling Dan to fight the Lich. That was the same as telling him to go die. The two of them were talking away from Dan, but Chloe was still shouting. She reminded Ars that just killing it according to their original plan would be more than enough. Ars replied that if Dan refused, he wouldn't force him. She kept raising her voice, saying that idiot didn't even know how strong the Lich actually was. She suddenly stopped talking when Dan said he would do it. Chloe was in shock. She was utterly speechless. Dan asked what he needed to do first. While having dinner, they listened to what Ars had to say. Chloe asked what exactly they needed to confirm. He explained that, just as Chloe said, Dan still didn't fully understand his own abilities. Dan admitted that was true. So before taking on the Lich, they needed to figure out the details, like how his abilities worked and what his limits were. Dan was curious about that too. He also wanted to know what kind of power did that truly possess. So he asked what they were going to do. The next day he looked pretty dumb just sitting there. He really did. He wore a bored expression on his face. He asked what she was doing. Chloe told him it was a mana scan. At the thought that he too might have mana, he got excited. Technically, anyone could have mana. So all he could do was guess. Ars said he would just take a quick look, and that maybe he'd learn something about that strange weapon, and Dan's that's what he said. Dan suddenly blushed and covered his body. He quickly blurted out that Ars wasn't that kind of inspector, not at all. He placed a hand on Dan's shoulder and began to inject his mana. Ars closed his eyes. Just then, his consciousness was pulled somewhere else. Before him stood a foggy, sinister figure. But a sudden, powerful gust of wind blew, forcing him to pull his hand away from Dan's shoulder. He had a look of pure bewilderment on his face. Dan asked if it was already over. He asked if Ars had found anything. Ars said no. Unfortunately, he didn't learn a single thing. Dan just said it was a shame. But deep down inside, Ars knew that this was no ordinary It was as if there was something else inside Dan's body. It felt alive, and just sensing that mana was enough to trigger a strong, repulsive reaction. He could already tell that this power was dangerous. Under a bright sky, a single skeleton was wandering around. It sensed something and looked around cautiously. Suddenly, a pebble struck it right in the center of its face, and it collapsed. A considerable amount of time had passed since Dan fell into this world. He didn't know the exact date, but he guessed it had been over 3 months. During that time, he had absorbed countless monsters. His body had already far surpassed that of an ordinary human, and even though the place was filled with unknown monsters, someone called out to him. Because he wasn't alone, he was able to endure it. Chloe said it was time to eat. Our protagonist happily finished his meal. He said it was an excellent meal. Complimenting Chloe on her amazing cooking skills, she proudly puffed out her chest and said it was just a basic skill. He asked if he could look forward to another dinner. She told him he was in for a surprise. Ayers noticed something. Dan was surprisingly good with children. He was Dan. I watched him naturally. On off the dinner preparations, onto Chloe. Ayers asked how the thing he was teaching him was coming along. He asked if he meant the mana manipulation training. He admitted that it wasn't going as well as he had hoped. He still couldn't feel a thing. He figured maybe it was just because he had no talent. Inwardly, Ayers thought to himself that this was just as he'd expected. Getting his hopes up was probably too much to ask. He also noticed that Dan, just like him, seemed to have no aptitude for magic. Ayers told him not to be too discouraged since he was already being influenced by mana. He told Dan that if he kept working hard, one day he might be able to control mana. Dan laughed and said that even if he couldn't use mana, he'd gotten quite a bit stronger. He hoped he could be of some help when they fought that lich or whatever it was. But upon hearing that, both Chloe and Ayers fell silent. Then, Ayers spoke up. He told Dan there would be no situation where he would be fighting the lich directly, which meant it left him completely confused. Ayers explained that from a normal perspective, Dan might seem strong enough, but he wasn't yet at the level to face the lich. His role was simply to absorb the corpse after Ayers had defeated it. Dan replied that he understood. Ayers added that it was for his own safety, so he shouldn't worry too much. He said that they would reach their destination in a few days, so he should get plenty of rest, he told Dan. Dan replied, okay. They continued on their journey. At night, they fought the undead and had dinner. The next day, they continued to walk and fight, and at night, while Ayers stood watch, they rested. Another day passed. That Chloe girl said she was already exhausted. Ayers told her to hang on just a little longer. The Kenyan. He said the entrance to the tomb would be there once they reached the end. Dan then offered to carry her bag for her. He slung her backpack over his shoulder and just said, let's go. At his words, she smiled. They crossed the canyon. Chloe had a hopeful look on her face. Ayers confirmed that she was right. Dan looked nervous. They had finally arrived at the lich's tomb. They went inside and descended the stairs. They arrived in an empty room. But it was more than just empty. Ayers said that it was clean. When Chloe heard that, she replied that it sounded ominous for some reason. Ayers warned them not to let their guard down, since something could appear at any moment. They teased him, asking, what, you really think a ghost? It gonna pop out or something? He paused for a moment. And then, saying he already knew what Ayers was going to say next, he joked, it's right behind me, isn't it? But his joke became reality. A ghost that was actually there replied, "Aw, you caught me." Dill let out a blood-curdling scream. The ghost said hey, but Day instinctively smacked it. He then started cussing it out for scaring him like that. Chloe asked if you could even hit a ghost with a club. Dill replied that what's important is having the sheer will to beat the crap out of it. While they were exploring the tomb, Dill asked Ayers what kind of creature a lich was. Ayers was quiet at first. Then, he said that a lich is the ruler of the land of the dead. He resurrects and commands countless undead. As they entered another room, an undead suddenly appeared, startling them. Ayers said that the lich had been resurrected and had fully regained its power. If he regained it, he would lead an army of the undead and bring ruin to the world. He continued, That's why they had to defeat him before he could regain his power. But even if they did, in 100 years he would just be resurrected again through magic. But that was all before heirs saw what Dan was capable of. If Dan could absorb the undead and destroy them completely, then maybe, just maybe, it would be possible to get rid of their master, too. Hearing this, Dan's eyes widened as he stared at him. He then said that he wasn't sure if the club would work the way they wanted it to, but it probably wouldn't be that hard. After all, it's not like he had to absorb every monster, and he himself didn't really know how it worked. But he was confident he'd figure it out somehow. He wasn't paying any attention to where he was walking. Chloe and Ars saw what was in front of him and grew worried. Chloe told him to wait. Dan looked confused. He turned around and asked why they weren't coming. Suddenly, Ars screamed at him to get out of there. Now, a magic circle began to glow. I had no idea what they were saying, and in the next moment, he was gone. As for Chloe and Ars, they were frozen in place. They were horrified. I was no longer with them. The hallway was quiet, but suddenly someone sprinted past it, full speed. It was Ars, and in his arms was Chloe. She asked him why on earth he was in such a hurry. She demanded to know what had just happened. Ars looked tense. He cursed himself for not being more careful. In a place like that, anything could happen at any moment. He could only hope he wasn't too late. Meanwhile, he collapsed onto the floor. He wondered what that flash of light had been. He looked around, but he had absolutely no idea where he was. That's when he was startled by something right in front of him. At its peak was a giant gate with a massive skull carved into it. He never expected to see anything like it. The gate itself seemed to scream that something horrifying was waiting on the other side. Still, since it wasn't a trap that would sever my limbs, I was a little relieved, forcing myself to stay calm. I waited for Ars. At the same time, Ars was not slowing down at all as he beat down the monsters. He was moving unbelievably fast. Chloe asked him what was going on. He told her that what Dan stepped on was a lich's teleportation magic circle. She asked where it had taken him. If his guess was correct, it was likely the lich's chamber. Dan looked around the room, and at what he saw, a bone-chilling terror washed over him. A figure in dark armor with a horn helmet and layers upon layers of black plates was sitting on a throne. Sat there. A purple cape was dragged over its shoulders, and with its hands resting calmly, it gave off the cold, otherworldly aura of a dark lord. But it didn't move. He felt a surge of anxiety. He realized that it was the lich, but it appeared to be asleep. He thought he was in luck. He thought that as long as he didn't wake it up, he might actually be able to survive this situation. He really hoped it would be that way, but there was a problem. He was already inside the room. Because there was a chance he might accidentally set off another trap, he decided to wait quietly, perfectly still in the darkness. But just then, his baseball bat began to glow. It had never done that before. So he had no idea why this was suddenly happening. The lich opened its eyes. He tensed up instantly. And then the lich moved. As its dark, helmeted face stared forward, purple flames erupted from its eyes, unleashing a terrifying and overwhelming aura. The situation became incredibly tense. It shifted its staff. And then it raised the staff high, and behind it, a purple, hismic flame blazed to life. Its black armor gleamed, and a horrified aura spread out in all directions. There was one other thing he knew for sure. He was completely screwed. Meanwhile, Chloe was in shock from what she had just discovered. Ars sensed that the lich had already awoken. Back to our main character. The strength drained from his legs, and he collapsed to the floor. He knew this enemy was on a completely different level of another dimension. I knew instantly that this was a dimensional being. As the lich pointed a finger at him, at its tip, power began to gather. He felt a sense of impending doom. A massive purple energy beam shot downwards, creating a violent explosion as it struck the ground. He knew there was no way to escape. Gritting his teeth, he decided to hit it back. He swung his bat, sending the powerful energy flying back like a baseball, pouring everything he had into it. The attack went straight back to the lich. Of course, the lich never expected that. right where the lich was floating. An explosion erupted. Dan watched cautiously. As the dust slowly settled, the lich appeared, completely unharmed. The lich's figure was revealed. Dan cursed under his breath. The pastor didn't even flinch. He was at a loss as to how he could possibly deal with a monster like this. The lich moved its finger again. Suddenly, from the ground, purple vines shot up. The vines wrapped around Dan's arms and legs. That's right. He was completely bound. The lich glared at him, saying that he possessed a peculiar power. And it asked if the source of that power was his heart. The lich reached its hand out towards him, as if to rip Dan's body open, said he'd know the answer. Suddenly, he sliced off the damn spotter's arm. He got them both surprised. He turned to see where the attack had come from. It was ours. This man was gathering his energy. A dark aura swirled around his blade. He glared right at the lich. The vines snapped. Doe was finally free. Ars asked if he was hurt, telling him to stand back and let him handle it. The lich unleashed a barrage of attacks toward Ars. They flew in from every direction. Explosions erupted all around them. Dust started to worry about Ars. The lich calmly waited for the outcome. Smoke covered the entire area. But from within the smoke, Ars swung his sword and sliced the lich in two. It was something the lich had not expected. And from the midst of the attacks, Ars walked out completely unscathed. The lich's bisected body slowly began to rejoin. The lich said that they were truly bound by a terrible fate. It slowly brought its two hands together in front of its chest. Between its palms, purple energy gathered, and a dark power swirled around its armored body. A massive blast of purple energy erupted from above him, spreading across the sky like a giant star. Da asked what that thing was. The lich called it the stars, origin, and unleashed it upon them. It was a massive wave of sinister energy. Seeing the overwhelming power, Dan's eyes widened and his jaw dropped. In front of him stood Ars, holding his ground, but purple energy erupted violently, shattering the earth and sending rocks and debris flying everywhere. When the chaos subsided, Ars was still standing before Dan, protecting him. His sword was plunged into the ground, and he gripped it tightly. He looked exhausted, and the lich was still floating above them. The massive explosion had cracked and torn up the ground all around them. But Ars and Dan stood on the only intact spot, completely unharmed. And clearly, the lich had not expected that. He remarked that Ars had always faced him alone, but this time, he brought a strange companion. So he wondered if Ars had prepared a trump card that would destroy his own body in the process. But Ars wasn't the only one who had prepared a gift. Once again, the lich brought his hands together and activated a spell called Whispers of the Void. Ars immediately went on guard. Suddenly, his surroundings began to blur. And as for the lich, was standing right next to him. This was a space, he said, made just for him. Ars asked if Rich planned to have a one-on-one duel there. Rich replied that would be nice, but the real plan was to open the gift that Ars had brought. A dagger. It was suddenly teleported into the space. Rich said he knew Ars had prepared the dagger to pierce his heart. But instead, that blade would be turned against him. Ars remained silent. He couldn't move a single muscle. He suspected this wasn't reality, but some kind of mental magic. He knew that breaking free wouldn't be easy. Normally, he would take his time to analyze and dismantle the spell. But if he delayed now, Dan's life would be in danger. All he could do was hope that Dan would hold on just a little longer. Meanwhile, Dan was being commanded to offer himself to the ruler of the dead and the terror of the living. A crushing pressure was forcing him to give everything. Rich wanted his flesh and his power. Suddenly, a giant phantom beast appeared. Its glowing eyes and massive fangs dominated the battlefield. It firmly rejected Rich's words, declaring that the vessel belonged to it. From within Dan's bat, its very existence was enraged that someone had dared to step into its domain without an ounce of fear. The lich had no idea what was happening. It didn't understand at all. Whatever this being in front of it was. One thing was clear, it was far more powerful. A moment later, Ars suddenly found himself back in the room. He stood there in a complete daze. The lich's magic had been shattered to pieces. To his surprise, the lich started screaming curses at him, yelling about how he brought something like this here. Ares saw an opening. He snapped into a fighting stance and lunged at the lich. His expression was dead serious. The moment the lich was struck down, Dan's monster rushed forward and devoured it without a trace. Dan groaned in pain. Hearing that sound, Ares grew worried. Then Dan asked, "What just happened?" His baseball bat began to glow brightly. Suddenly, a bolt of purple energy shot towards Dan. Ares recognized it instantly. It was the lich's mana. As the energy enveloped Dan, he screamed in agony. A dark and sinister aura began to blaze from his body. The amount of mana was overwhelming. Ares worried what would happen if Dan absorbed something like that. Dan clutched his chest tightly, his forehead slamming into the ground. I drove those words right into the ground, and then collapsed, covering his face. Ares ran to him and shouted for him to snap out of it. He wondered if this was a backlash from absorbing the lich. He was curious. Suddenly, someone said, "Lord Asilpheus." Ares froze in shock. He slowly turned toward the voice. A woman appeared. He heard someone else calling his name. The voice told him to find Aner. As soon as he heard that, he woke up. He screamed. He looked around his surroundings, and everything was quiet. This only served to confuse him more. He looked for Ars and Chloe, but they were nowhere to be found. He wondered where they had gone. Just then, he found a bag and a note nearby. It was a note saying that something urgent came up, and they had to leave first. It also said that thanks to him, they were able to defeat the lich. The lich. Unfortunately, he had never seen those characters before, so he couldn't read it. But more importantly, he had an ominous feeling. He thought that they might have abandoned him and left. Just a moment ago, Ares was not in a good mood. He asked the woman what she was doing here. The woman was Aeneas. She was a tall woman with long, crimson hair, a tall woman humbly and elegantly walking toward him. She was wearing a black dress, adorned with golden butterflies. The hem of the gown fanned out, like the wings of a butterfly. She smiled as she looked at him. She informed him that His Majesty, the Emperor, had summoned him. Ares sheathed his sword. The news came as a surprise to him. She asked since when that was something to be surprised about. After all, it's not like His Majesty has ever bothered to ask for your permission beforehand. Ares scowled. She said that since the business here seemed to be finished anyway, they could discuss the details of the palace. Just as they were about to step into the portal, someone suddenly called out to Ars. The two of them turned toward the direction of the voice. It was Chloe. She asked if Dan was okay. And then, she quickly asked what happened to the lich. But upon seeing Aeneas, she froze in horror. Her expression filled with rage. Aeneas, as if greeting an old friend, waved at her. At that moment, Chloe found Dan collapsed on the floor. She rushed over and tried to wake him. Ares told her to calm down. He explained that Dan had absorbed a lich and likely fainted from the shock. His life wasn't in any danger. Meanwhile, Aquinas was just watching the scene unfold. Ares didn't look pleased at all. He clearly had more questions about this, but he had to leave. He called Chloe over and told her to pack a small backpack with some food and a map and leave it for Dan. Chloe was surprised, but she understood the task. Aquinas watched them quietly. She was starting to get suspicious of Dan. After all, she had just heard that he'd absorbed the lich. She found that quite amusing. It was very intriguing information. She couldn't even hide her wicked smile. A few seconds later, she caught herself and quickly composed her expression. At the same time, everything was ready. Ares said it was time to go. They started walking toward the portal, but Ares suddenly stopped beside Aquinas. He leaned in close and whispered a warning to her. It would be wise to lose your interest in that child. That is, if you want to live a long life. Before stepping into the portal, Chloe looked back at Dan. Aquinas did the same, completely unaware of the commotion happening around him. Dan was still lying there, sleeping peacefully. She quietly mumbled that she would keep that in mind, and then the portal closed. Now Dan whined about how cruel the others were. He was truly sad. They hadn't been together for long, but he already thought of them as family. And he couldn't believe that they had just abandoned him like that. For a moment he even thought he was the only one who genuinely cared. After being angry for a while, he finally accepted that they must have had their reasons. Errors had told him that they defeated the Lich thanks to him. But honestly, Dan doubted if he had even done anything, really. And even though he'd absorbed the Lich, he didn't feel any stronger at all. He scratched his head, thinking. And that because he figured he should at least get some compensation by grabbing the loot. A moment ago, they had just defeated a huge boss, so there had to be good stuff lying around. The hero, cursed by its grade, it gave him an elven skull orb. There was also a legendary grade staff of pain and despair. He found a unique grade screaming evil magic sword, a legendary grade blood-stained ritual dagger, and a hero grade Soul's warhammer burning with terrible vengeance. Glancing at another pile of weapons, he decided to just forget about it. Every single one of them looked like it would curse him for life. This ain't it. Soon, he walked out of the tomb. He took out a map and a compass. It was much harder than he thought. After all, he'd spent his whole life finding his way with smartphone apps. According to the map, there was a village past the western forest. It was a long way. Van let out a long sigh. He was alone again. Nevertheless, he continued his journey. Along the way, he ran into some undead. The skeleton staggered back from the blow. 3 months had passed since he parted ways with Ars's group. During that time, he had crossed the wastelands alone. Thanks to what Ars and Chloe had taught him, he had managed to survive without much difficulty. Still, it had been a very lonely journey. But at last, he was leaving that desolate place behind. It was the first patch of green he'd seen in almost a year. He arrived in an area filled with lush grass and towering trees. He had arrived in the region. Finally, it was peaceful and beautiful. No monsters, no endless sands, and no storms. It was just serene nature. An explosion erupted nearby. He simply lay at the direction of the explosion. His expression was completely unfazed. In that forest, someone was running with incredible speed. He was a blonde man who looked like an adventurer. He cursed under his breath. He asked himself why something like this was happening. An attack nearly grazed him, and the explosion sent him flying. He had no idea why this creature was even here in the first place. It was a wyvern. He thought this was the end. Even Robert, the strongest among them, had died without being able to lift a single finger. So for a bronze rank hunter like him, there was no chance of winning. He had only come here to take care of a few goblins. But instead, he ran into this horrifying creature. It roared right in front of his face. He accepted that this was his limit. But then, suddenly, a figure charged straight into the wyvern's mouth. When he opened his eyes, he saw her. He recognized her. It was Aliasa. She called him Alt. She asked why he was just standing there, and told him to get up immediately. He said that he was supposed to be the bait, so they could all escape. He asked her why she came back. She replied that she couldn't just leave him to play the hero all by himself. He was touched by her words. He didn't argue any further. He expected that she must have some sort of plan. She replied that if she'd had a plan, Robert wouldn't have already been killed. She told him that when she counted to 3, he had to run without looking back. He said he understood. She began to count, but before she could even finish, a wyvern attacked and sent her flying. Alt was horrified. He screamed her name. Suddenly, an arrow zipped past him. The arrow lodged itself in the wyvern's face. Alt was stunned to see another person. He knew, Cirrus, appear. He was stunned. She was the one who had fired the arrow. She apologized to him, explaining that she could just run away by herself either. He screamed at her, telling her to get out of there right now. The wyvern moved. It charged straight for Cirrus. She was about to be devoured. In that moment, she wished someone would come for her. Tears streamed from her eyes. And then, unexpectedly, someone appeared. He smashed the wyvern's head in. Cirrus and Alt were completely stunned. It was Dan. The protagonist just absolutely annihilated the wyvern. A moment later, Alt and Cirrus sincerely thanked him. The wyvern, with a giant lump on its head, lay dead, and said it was no big deal, but quickly insisted that wasn't true. Dan had just saved their lives. If he hadn't stepped in to help, they would already be dead. And thankfully, Alrisa's life wasn't in danger either. Both. Seeing him take down a wyvern in a single blow, Alt asked Dan a question. Are you, by any chance, a high-rank hunter? Alt figured he had to be a gold rank, or maybe even a platinum rank. That was his best guess. But our protagonist had no idea what to say. They waited for his answer. And asked what they were talking about. The two of them wore puzzled expressions. Dan had absolutely no idea what they meant by any of that. A little later, Alt helped Arisa up and they continued on their way. Dan confessed that he was actually from another world. He figured they would find it hard to believe. But Alt, her savior, wouldn't lie about something like that. Cirrus said she had never heard of such a thing. But then again, she added that in this world, teleportation magic already exists. So, she figured interdimensional travel might be possible, too. Meanwhile, she was carrying the weapons of her fallen comrades. Dan offered to help, but she told him it was too much to ask of him. Alt added that they don't know everything about the world either, so they're open to strange possibilities. Dan then realized that a case like his must be extremely rare. Alt admitted that he was truly shocked earlier. A weird monster just appeared out of nowhere and devoured the wyvern's corpse. Then it suddenly transformed into a club. That weapon was emitting an insane amount of mana. Alt asked if everyone from Dan's world had abilities like that. Dan was suddenly put in an awkward position, so he just replied, probably. It was just easier than trying to explain everything. At last, they arrived. Alt explained where they were. It was a place called Siltrok, the Lamania Kingdom's easternmost territory. A moment later, someone was holding back a different kind of tears. Upon seeing him, asked what was wrong. He wondered if Dan was disappointed because the village wasn't as grand as he had expected. Dan shook his head and said that wasn't it. It was just that it had been so long since he had seen so many people. Later that day, they had a hearty meal at another tavern. They drank a lot, too. He looked completely satisfied. My first legal drink as an adult. Who would have thought I'd be having it in a whole different world? I never would have dreamed of it. Not that I'd ever had a drink before, but still. The alcohol here tasted different. Alt and Cirrus said they had to take care of their comrades first. They needed to treat Eliasa and recover Robert's body. When Dan heard that they had lost a comrade, he felt a pang of discomfort. Alt noticed the change in his expression. He handed Dan some money and told him to get some rest at a nearby inn. He said they'd meet up later. Dan accepted it gratefully. He figured they would come back after they finished their business. Before he knew it, Dan's face was already flushed. Looking at the world before him, he couldn't deny it any longer. He really was in another world. There were dwarves walking around, and even humanoid creatures that looked like beastmen. And so I started to think about what I should do first. Then, I made up my mind. For now, I'd just get some sleep. When he woke up the next day, his eyes were puffy and swollen. He lay in bed, lost in thought for a moment. Sleeping in a real bed again, he completely lost track of time. Suddenly, someone knocked on the door. Dan opened it and asked, "Who is it?" It was Harris. She asked if he'd gotten a good night's rest. Alyosha was standing right behind her. He just stared at them, dumbfounded. He clearly wasn't expecting this at all. They all headed downstairs. Someone immediately called out to the protagonist. It was Alt, and he waved at him. Aaron saw him and walked over. The food arrived shortly after. Alt explained that Alyosha had been insistent on seeing him, so she could thank him personally. She looked a little embarrassed. Alt also admitted that things were so chaotic yesterday that he didn't get to properly express his gratitude. Aaron said it was nothing, and that he actually slept soundly, thanks to them. In response, Alt formally introduced himself. He belonged to the Righteous Wanderers party, and was a copper-rank hunter. Alt was human. Then he introduced Alyosha, Wilder, and the party's only support member, Saris. She was human, too. They asked what hunters and ranks were. They seemed surprised by the question. Judging by their reaction, it seemed he had asked something extremely basic. Alt quickly realized his mistake. He remembered that Darren didn't know much about this place, and explained that a hunter is someone who hunts wild animals or monsters, or deals with various commissions. He explained are the people who do that. To do so, a hunter had to belong to the guild. Hunters usually form parties. To operate, the minimum is 2 people, but they usually consist of 4. The seal signified the rank bestowed by the guild. In order, there was steel, copper, silver, gold, platinum, and finally, mithril. Some parties had members of mixed ranks, but since the quests they could take were based solely on the lowest ranked member in the party, most preferred to team up with people of the same rank. Steel and copper rank hunters usually hunted wild animals or small monsters. They also handled other mage jobs. Silver rank hunters are veteran hunters who mainly focus on hunting monsters. Most people end their hunter careers without ever reaching the silver rank. A gold rank hunter is considered high-level personal. Even a large guild branch might only have about 3 or 4 such parties. From the gold rank onwards, rather than forming a party composed entirely of gold rank hunters, it was more common for one to lead a party. Alt said that he wasn't sure of the exact number of platinum rank hunters, but that there were probably less than 20 of them in the entire guild. In fact, in his entire life, he had never met one before. And one last thing, in the entire history of the continent, there were only 10 mithril insignias in existence, and among them, the number of currently active mithril insignia hunters was just 3. They were basically living legends. Dan now understood just how incredible the ranking system really was. The insignia's rank wasn't just a show of power. It was proof of identity, and also served as a kind of credit rating. That's why Lust Hunter insignias sold for high prices on the black market. Of course, pretending to be a hunter was a serious crime. To earn an insignia, hunters had to complete numerous quests from the guild. Alt's team was a copper insignia party. It wasn't anything to brag about, but he admitted they managed to get by. Dan felt like his head was going to explode from all the information. Speaking of which, Alt decided to ask him something. He wanted Dan to join his party. Dan was taken aback. Alt quickly clarified that he wasn't trying to force him. But Dan didn't know much about this world. He would probably need money and some form of identification, and as it happened, their party had an open spot. In other words, their interests aligned quite well. Dan had to find a way back home. Until I could find a way, I knew that I had to adapt to this society, at the very least. To do that, I needed money and knowledge. Alyosha mentioned that she heard Dan was unbelievably strong. Alt and Saris told her that since he took down a wyvern in a single blow, she wouldn't have to worry about him dying anytime soon. But suddenly, someone called them liars. With a loud bang, they slammed their hand on the table. It was a blonde girl, and she accused them of making it all up. She looked completely unimpressed. Alyosha told the girl named Mary to stop bothering them and get lost. Mary mocked her, asking if pets were allowed to sit at the same table as people. She told Alyosha that since her fur was shedding, she should eat on the floor like the animal she was. This woman was the human, Merit Sagtilan, leader of the noble oppressors. Alyosha was furious. Alt quickly tried to calm her down. Just then, Mary turned her attention to Dan. He was a face she had never seen before. She asked if he was the one who'd caught the wyvern. Our hero simply answered, yeah. She mentioned that the spoils would sell for a hefty price, since they were going to sell it. She asked if they'd brought it with them. Alt just said that there were some complications. Barry sneered. To her, that was just more proof that they were lying. Dan raised his voice at her. He said he'd been putting up with her nonsense, but it was time to stop. Mary asked what he was going to do if she didn't. At that, Dan exploded. He cracked his knuckles and said this little brat was really starting to get on his nerves. Mary was enraged that he called her a brat. She shot back, calling him a lowlife who crawled out from who knows where. Being called a lowlife just pissed Dan off even more. Just then, a man with orange hair stepped in and apologized. Dan looked confused. The man simply smiled at him. Mary was annoyed that the man, whose name was Brian, had interfered. He apologized to her, saying that they were the ones who had interrupted the meal. He suggested they go back to their own table. Brian was a member of a group called the Noble Oppressors. He told Mary to just go and eat, pushing her toward their table. She screamed no at him. He was starting to get annoyed with Dan, too. Dan grabbed Brian's shoulder and asked what the problem was. Brian's expression turned serious. He glared at Dan and suggested they call it a day. Dan was caught off guard. He let out a sigh. Then he looked him straight in the eye and said that those two were already getting on his nerves. Silence filled the room. Dan and Brian were glaring at each other when a small person tapped on Brian's leg and asked what was with this murderous atmosphere. She also told Brian to stop. After all, Mary was the one who started it. That day, all Brian could do was sigh. The little girl apologized for causing a scene. She explained that hearing he'd taken down a wyvern in one hit was just something hard to believe. That's why Mary had been so rude. Her name was Ariel. She was a dwarf. He just stared at her. He couldn't believe that this tiny kid was the most mature person here. Of course, he was wise enough to keep that thought to himself. Ariel told Brian that he wasn't sent to join that fight, but to meet it, reminding him that it was, and told Dan. He glanced over at his seat. Art and Saris both looked worried. So Dan just said he didn't want to cause a scene. He told them they could just take Mary and leave. He said. Ari thanked him for being so understanding. Mary peeked out from behind Brian's back and stuck her tongue out at Dan. Dan's face immediately flushed with anger. He told him to get lost before he did something he would regret. When he returned to his seat, Saris admired how well he had handled the situation. She said that Mary has a foul mouth, but her heart is in the right place. Dan quickly changed the subject and asked where he should start. He meant with becoming a hunter. Later that day, Dan received his badge. Art told him he just had to pay the registration fee. Dan couldn't believe it was that simple. Art then asked if he had any money, since the change he'd given him earlier wasn't much. He asked if I had any money. He said his traveling companion had left him some. He emptied the contents of his pocket. When only a single coin fell out, he was confused. But Art quickly realized it was a gma. One gma was worth 1,000 crowns. And each coin had a different value, until one jozokuo was worth 1 crown. A dumwo was worth 10 crowns. And Yuno was equal to 100 crowns, and a single gima was worth 1,000 crowns. I asked if that would be enough. Alt said the registration fee was 500 crowns. I was stunned. That was half a gima. Their table suddenly fell silent. Now that Dan was registered, Alt knew it was no longer time to pester him. Dan asked if he was leaving already. Alt explained that there was a lot to prepare before the raid. Besides, Dan also needed time to rest and prepare on his own. He told Dan to meet him there again in 3 days. At the thought of that, a pleased expression appeared on Dan's face. Alt understood how he felt. He said that the inn was run by the hunter, Ariel. Since most of the guests staying there were hunters, he said Dan could spend his time making some connections. And if he got bored, he could even try completing a quest or two. If after 3 days Dan was still on his own, they said they would take him in, even if he didn't join the party permanently. They could still do the raid together. He said he would think about it. They said their goodbyes. He told him to get back safely. After they left, he said he let out a sigh. His morning had been an absolute mess. Was holding a single gold coin in his hand. It was worth 1,000 crowns. And just this morning, breakfast had been 3 crowns per person. The meat and drinks, plus last night's lodging, brought the total to 25 crowns. With this money he, for about 20 days, could cover his room and board. He quickly realized this. That way he used to live, that much money wouldn't even buy a few set meals. Suddenly, a wave of homesickness washed over him. He had been on the verge of living a comfortable life, but now, he had to struggle just to survive, all over again. Sighing again, he thought he'd better prepare for a hunting quest. That's what he decided. A little later, he bought some gear. And the shopkeeper looked him up and down and pegged him as a total tourist. She quoted him a price of 230 crowns for the gear. He knew he was probably getting ripped off. And so, he walked out feeling a little swindled. Still, it was a good thing he hadn't tried to buy a full suit of plate armor. After that, he was at a loss for what to do next. Since he was already running low on money, he decided to take on a quest. He approached the guild receptionist. On top of the desk, he placed down a piece of paper. He wanted to take on a long quest. She remembered him as the newbie who had come in that morning. She explained that the quest he had chosen was for silver rank hunters and above. Speaking to him politely, then she pointed to the section where the iron rank quests were posted, and so his grand, epic adventure began with carrying sacks of flour, cleaning out the stables, and doing a mountain of laundry. At this point, he couldn't even call himself a hunter. He felt more like a cheap, hired hand. Soon, the sun began to set. Looking like a zombie, he dragged himself back to the inn. He had spent the entire day doing back-breaking labor. This was definitely not what he had imagined when he signed up to become a hunter. For the whole day's work, he had earned a measly 30 crowns. As always, he was living from hand to mouth. He muttered to himself that no matter what world he was in, life was still a grind. As he walked down the street, he passed a food stall. A man was selling grilled skewers. His mouth immediately began to water, and he told himself that there wouldn't be any harm in buying just one. After all, he worked hard today. The mystery meat of the 3 crowns. He bought a skewer. The moment he took a bite, his eyes widened in amazement. It was absolutely delicious. Honestly, even someone who'd lived their whole life on nothing but instant noodles would have fallen in love with this. Dan wondered what the secret ingredient could be. As he was talking to the merchant about the food, someone suddenly spotted him. This person pulled out a compass, and its needle pointed directly at Dan. She watched him quietly. At that moment, Dan was still asking the merchant why the food was so incredibly tasty. Suddenly, someone tugged on the hem of his shirt. She told him she'd finally found him, calling him Danny. When he turned around, he saw a little girl with elven ears and red hair. She was wearing a witch's hat. She gave him an exasperated smile and called him her destiny. A moment later, we see Danny listening to the girl's story. She told him that he was her destined hero. He demanded proof. She said it came from her master's prophecy. According to the prophecy, the one the compass points to is the hero who will save the world, and she was fated to aid him. Of course, Dan found something like that hard to believe. She didn't suspect a thing. Her master was a witch of prophecy. Dan asked if she was famous. The woman said her master's prophecies have never once been wrong. She said proudly. When her master's shoulder aches, she predicts rain. And sure enough, it rained that very day. Da said that sounded just like a weather forecast. He remarked. That remark immediately made her furious. She accused him of saying something blasphemous and demanded that he take it back at once. Da quickly apologized and took it back. He didn't need to start a religious war over the weather. Then, he asked what happens now, if he really is this hero of destiny. What happens now, he asked. She explained that her master told her to help the hero of destiny. Whatever he was planning, her magic would surely be a great help to him. Da asked what she thought he might be planning. He asked. She answered with full confidence. You're going to save the world. Da immediately cut her off and said she was wrong, because his one and only goal was to return to his original world. That answer left her completely bewildered. Da knew who her master was. This hero stuff, he had no idea what it was all about, and as for saving the world, he said he didn't have the slightest bit of interest. He said he had a million reasons to get back home as soon as possible, so she should go find someone else. He didn't know what she was looking for, because he was absolutely certain it wasn't him. And with that, he left. His words saddened her. Mary saw the whole thing. She grinned from ear to ear, saying it looked like that woman just got rejected. Brian told her to stop meddling in other people's love lives. He suggested that if she had nothing better to do, she should just come and help him out. She shot back that he just didn't get it. That other people's lives were the best form of entertainment. He retorted that while she was enjoying her entertainment, he, the party leader, had to deal with a trainload of paperwork that he was drowning in. She yelled that handling that kind of stuff for her was his entire reason for existing. She argued that a noble has plenty of duties to another noble. Brian then realized that the woman was the disciple of the witch from the prophecy, Dennis. Now that was some pretty interesting information. Just then, Dennis gave her disciple a compass. It was supposed to lead her to her destiny, a magical artifact. He had told her disciple, Ariel, to go to him. And just like that, Ariel set off toward her destiny. But what awaited her next was something completely unexpected. At present, Do was carrying a few sacks of goods. He was sweating bullets. An old woman thanked him for his hard work. De greeted her warmly. He went over to her and struck up a conversation. Ariel watched him from a distance. She couldn't understand why he was doing menial chores all day long. The old woman, saying he did a fantastic job, gave him a little extra as a bonus. De expressed his gratitude to her. Ariel wondered if he was completely penniless. She doubted if he was really the person her master had told her about. She was wondering what she should do now. Just then, he spoke to her, snapping her out of her thoughts. He couldn't believe she was still there. He already knew she had been following him the entire day. He told her to just stop and go back to her master, or wherever she came from. He told her that he wasn't who she thought, the hero of destiny. He smugly said it wasn't the same. She answered that her master had passed away. He immediately apologized. She remembered that he wanted to return to his original world. So, she decided to help him. Whether it was finding a way back home, or just cleaning the barn, she made up her mind to help him somehow. The next day, at the guild, Alt was wearing armor. He was sitting in a corner. When someone called him, it was serious. She said that Den was nowhere to be seen, and didn't seem to be in his room either. Alt thought that was strange. Just then, someone pointed out that it was obvious. It was Mary, who said Den had run away. She said after all that bragging about killing at Wyverness below, he probably got scared the truth would come out and fled. Alt noticed she was fully armed. He asked her what she was doing there. It seemed he hadn't heard the news. She explained that there had been reports of monsters not native to the area appearing nearby, so naturally our party's noble oppressor as graciously volunteered to scout the surrounding territory, and one of those duties falls to the newbie, who's lost half his combat power, was to supervise a group of hunters. Alt said that he could tolerate them looking down on him and Ceres, but he would not stand for it if they insulted Dan. He warned them to stop. The woman with glasses from Mary's party, the one with the adoptive father, asked who Dan was. Brian couldn't give her an immediate answer. That woman wasn't from there. Party, not a BC. She was Veronica. Ceres yelled that Denny had saved their lives, and if Mary continued to disrespect him, she wouldn't just stand by and do nothing. Mary scoffed, saying that their so-called savior was busy with a little romance. Ceres asked what she meant. Mary explained that some elf woman was talking about fate or something along those lines. She added that the two of them probably got a little too close, causing him to forget his promises. She added, emitting a dark aura, Ceres stepped closer and said, "That's a lie." Mary froze. Ceres said that Denny came from another world, and that besides them, he didn't know anyone else. So how, in just 3 days, could he suddenly have a lover? It was completely ridiculous. She made it clear that her patience was running out. Just then, someone asked, who exactly ran away? Everyone turned toward the source of the voice. Brian seemed calm, but Alt had a shocked expression on his face. It was Dan, and Ariel was standing right behind him. Dan brightly greeted everyone, but what he said next would surprise them even more. He saw that Alt was happy to see him. Dan smiled at him. He said he hoped he wasn't late. Mary immediately accused him of being a traitor. Both Ariel and Dan were at a loss for words. Mary scolded Dan for ditching the people he was supposed to party with to go and stick with someone else. And while all this was happening, someone noticed the dark aura surrounding Ceres. This girl seems to be getting jealous. Anyway, Mary called him a shameless traitor. Dan, annoyed with her, asked why she was meddling in his affairs. Alt said it wasn't mandatory, so it didn't matter. Still, this was completely unexpected. He was talking about the elf magician, and he asked how they had met. Ceres was still radiating a very dangerous aura. Dan said it was a long story. Ariel, however, calmly stated that she was the one who had found him, saying that fate had led her to his side. Dan couldn't believe she had actually said those words out loud. Model. Both Art and Mary's faces started to turn red. Meanwhile, Cirrus looked like she was about to commit murder at any second. Brian, who was sitting at another table and listening quietly, even started to blush himself. He felt like this place had suddenly started airing a top-tier romance drama. Dan quickly shouted at Ariel, telling her not to say things like that, because people might get the wrong idea. Alt asked for her name. She told him her name. He then asked if she would be participating in the subjugation. She said yes, but made it clear that she had no interest in anything other than helping Dan. She even got her hunter's license yesterday for that very reason. Brian thought she seemed like the devoted wife type. Veronica said that she looked too pure. All said he was relieved that they had more people, especially since Alasha couldn't come because her injuries hadn't fully healed yet. Alt apologized for not discussing it with him first. Alt said it was fine. Since everyone had already gathered, Alt suggested they head out. Everyone agreed. Goblins, they have the intelligence of a small child, and are a species of small monster. They're hostile by nature, and are capable of using crude tools. They primarily raid human settlements to steal livestock and property. A single goblin isn't much of a threat, but because of their pack hunting instincts, they're a serious nuisance. Alt explained that recently, in the small outlying villages of Silthro, reports of goblin raids had become frequent. The last time he went out to find a goblin den, he was attacked by a wyvern, and that's when he met Dan. Now, Dan finally understood what was going on. He got the situation, but why Mary's party was following them, that he still couldn't figure out. Alt explained that between the wyvern incident and a few other things, there had been a strange surge of monsters near Silthro. So he believed they were there to investigate the anomaly and provide protection. Mary told Dan he should consider it an honor. After all, they had personally graced a piddling little steel rank like him with their presence. Dan was clearly starting to get annoyed. He asked if there was really no one else they could have sent besides those people. Alt understood that Dan might still be upset because of their first encounter, but insisted that despite their appearances in Noble Opel, to be honest, they were a very promising party. Even though they were only in their second year and a brand new party at that, they had been promoted to the silver badge rank in just 1 year. They showed off some dazzling firepower, and right now they were candidates for the fastest promotion to a gold badge. But Day still looked at them with a suspicious glint in his eye. Mary turned to Ariel and asked where she came from. Brian quickly tried to stop her, but Ariel looked completely uninterested in the question. Alt had to admit, they were certainly a unique bunch of people. Day muttered that someday he was going to smack that arrogant little brat right on the back of the head. Before continuing, Alt remembered something. Since you use a blunt weapon, you'll take the front. Cirrus and Ariel, you two will take the rear. After that, he asked Ariel what kind of magic she specialized in. She seemed confused by the question and asked him what he meant. Alt wondered if his question had really been that hard to understand. I mean, he wasn't a magic expert, but there was destruction, enhancement, alchemy, summoning, there were a few major types. He admitted that he had heard about the classifications. For example, Veronica was skilled in enhancement magic. He figured that since most mages have a main type of magic, knowing Ariel's would be helpful for their strategy. He shyly admitted that this was his first time partying up with a mage. Mages are so rare that most people hardly ever see one until they reach the silver badge rank. C1. Now she understood what he meant. Just as she was about to answer, an arrow suddenly flew right past her face. Dane snatched it just in time, so she wasn't hit. Everyone immediately got into a defensive stance. It was shot by goblins, and no one had sensed them. They glared in the direction the arrow came from. At the goblin's surprise attack, Brian immediately switched into a combat stance, but Mary stopped him. She told him they didn't need to get involved. After all, since they were official hunters, she wanted to leave it to Alt's party. A goblin let out a loud shriek, but before it could even move, it was already hit by Dane's bat. Only then did Dane spot the other goblins. Some had already been slashed to death, while others had arrows sticking out of them. He looked at his party members and remarked that it was easier than he'd thought. Alt said that his skills were still as impressive as ever. Sarah mentioned it was strange for goblins to ambush armed hunters like them. Alt agreed, noting that goblins usually prey on the weak, so they typically go after children or the elderly. First, while it wasn't clear if it was intentional, they had targeted Ariel, the mage, first. In any case, since this likely wasn't all of them, they had to find the goblin nest and wipe them out. They suddenly had a realization. Ah, we should have kept one of them alive. He then asked if they had to go even deeper now. Sirius and Alt's jaws dropped. Even Ariel had a shock look on her face, and in the middle of all that, they just kept on asking what in the world this nest thing was supposed to look like. Mary was also in shock. They continued to chatter away. When he saw that no one dared to make a sound, he got confused. Is something wrong? He asked. He had absolutely no idea the giant red monster was looming right behind his back. Alt screamed at him, "Look behind you." Dai slowly turned around. The monster's claws were already reaching for him, was being swung around. Mary charged forward with her spear and knocked its arm aside. She was already in a full battle stance. Tan and Alt were both surprised to see her take the lead. They never expected Mary to be the first one to make a move. Brian told Dan to stay back. He said that his party would handle it from here. Dan was speechless. Brian was completely serious. He never expected a mountain troll to appear this close to the bandits' hideout. He told Mary that something was definitely off about this situation. Mary warned everyone to stay on their guard, because that monster was not going to be an easy opponent. Dan announced that he was joining the fight, but Alt immediately shot him down, saying he would only get in the way. Alt admitted that Dan was strong, but their party noble was also very experienced. If Dan were to jump in now, he'd most likely just disrupt their coordination. So Alt suggested that for now Dan should just trust them. Dan thought about it. Ariel just sighed, and Brian turned to Veronica. He gave the signal. She began to chant an incantation. Battle Spirit. She activated the enhancement. The spell strengthened her party members. Alt was amazed that she could cast an enhancement spell on 3 people at once. The rock mountain troll eyed them, then charged straight for Mary. She raised her shield, barely managing to block its claws, but the impact was immense. The monster knocked her backward. At the same time, Ari aimed her crossbow at the monster. She fired an arrow just as Brian charged in. It struck the rock mountain troll right in the eye. It staggered back. Brian called out to the lady. She already knew what to do. She positioned her shield so he could launch himself high into the air, and then she left the monster to him. Brian gripped his sword and slashed its other eye. As blood sprayed like a fountain, the rock mountain troll roared in agony. Dad was stunned to see how incredible they were. The party members moved as if they were a single entity. They looked like a true team that had trained together hundreds of times. Brian landed next to Mary. He had blocked the troll's line of sight, but the wound was shallow. A troll's regeneration works in a flash. It would just regenerate without a proper magic attack. This was the absolute worst matchup for them. Mary suggested they aim for the heart, the source of its regeneration. She told Veronica to get ready. The noble oppressor party was known for its fluent energy and stable formation, making them a highly polished team. However, even they had one fatal weakness, and that was their lack of firepower. Aaron's crossbow was slow to reload, making it difficult to inflict any serious damage on giant monsters. Brayer, who fought on the front lines with Mary, used 2 short daggers, which were ill-suited for fighting large monsters, and Veronica, the party's only mage, could only use enhancement spells, meaning her offensive capabilities were virtually zero. Standing at the very front, Mary wielded a unique weapon called a lance. Lances are typically designed for mounted combat, with their center of gravity shifted toward the back. This made it difficult for an infantryman to wield it to its full potential. But the noble oppressor party compensated for this weakness and out of their peculiar way. They focused all of their enhancement magic on a single person, and that target was none other than Mary. Veronica cast strength enhancement, speed enhancement, and endurance enhancement on her. She cast a weapon enhancement spell. As a heavy infantry combatant, Mary used stacked enhancement spells to gain explosive power and speed. In the end, not even the cavalry could keep up with the speed she had reached. Seeing this, Sirius's jaw dropped. Meanwhile, Ariel watched intently. Because of this, Mary earned a nickname at the Hunters Guild. People called her the Golden Unicorn. The rock mountain troll could barely react, let alone register how fast she was moving. It only managed a slight response. In the next instant, she pierced straight through the troll's left side. Emerging from the other side, she let out a smirk and laughed. Alt and the others stood there with their jaws agape, completely stunned. He could see her through the massive hole that had been torn through the troll's body. Mary proudly declared that a pathetic troll like that was no match for her. She proudly declared. She even started to boast about her party, but she couldn't finish her sentence. Suddenly, she coughed up blood. Alt and Sarai's froze. In shock, Brian immediately rushed to her side. He told her that using that method puts an extreme strain on her body, and immediately started scolding her. Mary always took the lead for the nobles. She simply said they had to set an example. For her, that kind of sacrifice was nothing. Then she said they should head back for now and call for reinforcements. Unfortunately for them, the situation was far from over. It slammed right through her chest, and Brian's eyes widened in pure shock. To say she looked confused would be an understatement. The strength left her legs. The color instantly drained from her face. Before them, from the dark forest, numerous monsters slowly began to appear. They walked out one by one in a single file line. They were goblins and trolls. Bra stared forward and asked, "What in the world are those?" There were just too many of them. Alt felt a cold chill run down his spine. He asked, "Where did all these monsters even come from?" Mary called out to Veronica. Veronica jumped in surprise. Mary told her to take Aram and the others and get out of here. She said she would buy them time. Aaron immediately shot her a worried look. Brian was just about to speak. Harry already knew what he wanted to say, but he pleaded, "Please, don't say it." She reminded him of noblesse. "What I say that right now, as a noble, it was their turn to fulfill their duty." Brian's face twisted in agony. Just then, someone told him not to be so dramatic, and the tense moment was suddenly shattered. The voice said there was a limit to how much he could look down on someone. It was Dan. He asked them if they really thought he would abandon her and run away. Everyone stared at him in complete shock. Even Sears and Ariel hadn't expected this. Mary frowned, telling him to stop being so stubborn and leave, especially after seeing the last battle. Besides, with that crude weapon of his, he couldn't even put a scratch on a troll. And she said that even if he got lucky and managed to kill one, there was no way he could handle all of them on his own. Dan just shrugged and said, "Compared to fighting ours, this is a piece of cake." Unfortunately, that comment only made Mary even angrier. She screamed at him, "Stop talking nonsense and move. We don't have time for this." Right at that moment, a troll raised its fist and swung at her. The moment Mary saw it, she had a gut feeling. This was the end for her. The band stepped forward. With one swing of his bat, he struck the monster. Its entire arm was blown off. Mary and Brayer were completely dumbfounded. The troll clutched its bleeding shoulder and roared in agony. And then, he casually called out to the veteran hunter. He asked her what the plan was. He added that everyone else was waiting. Mary was so flabbergasted. She could only stare at him. Alt quickly added that they would fight too. Aaron stepped forward, asking what kind of teammate would abandon their leader. Mary froze. For a moment, she didn't say a word. Then, after taking a deep breath, her expression turned serious. She ordered Brayer and Sarai to focus on the goblins first. There were too many trolls, so they had to be dealt with one at a time. She said that while Danny handled the trolls, the rest of them would draw their attention. But suddenly, someone said, "Hold on a second." It was Ariel. She calmly said that she would take care of it. Then blinked in surprise. He asked her if she really had a plan. Ariel just smirked. Then, she reminded Alt of the question he'd asked earlier, the one about her dominant spirit magic. She revealed that she doesn't have one. There was almost no magic she couldn't use, saying it was because there was no other choice. After activating mana amplification, she focused, stacking the amplification and adding elemental amplification on top, before lifting herself into the air. As she began to cast Rising Dragon's flame of fire started to gather. At the tip of her staff, a massive tornado of fire erupted. It completely swallowed the monster's whole The flames swept across the battlefield, incinerating a wide area of the forest. Ariel's expression was calm and serious. All anyone could do was watch as the forest turned into a hellscape. A moment later, she slowly descended back to the ground. The party was completely stunned, just staring at her. Ariel turned towards them. She smiled gently and said the problem was solved. For a few seconds, no one said a word. Only the sizzling sound of the monsters burning filled the air. Mary let out a quiet laugh. She said the whole thing was completely ridiculous, and then she collapsed. Brian, panicking, rushed to her side. Her complexion looked worse than ever before. The doctor informed them that Mary had been struck with a fatal poison. It seemed to be a rare toxin, one that wasn't normally found anywhere near this area. The doctor had already done everything he could, but if they didn't find the antidote soon, he couldn't guarantee that Mary would survive. Brian quietly said he understood. Meanwhile, Di wondered if Mary would be alright. Ariel remained silent. Di looked around, thinking something was strange. Since Mary used to be a noble, he had expected her to be treated in a grand mansion. He couldn't understand why, instead of that, they had brought her to such a shabby place. I couldn't understand it. Just then, Ariel revealed that Mary was no longer a noble. Di blinked in surprise. He asked what she meant. After all, Brian followed her everywhere, calling her my lady. Aaron explained that Mary did indeed come from a noble family, and it was also true that Brian was once her servant. She explained that it was a fact, but all of that was in the past. A long time ago, when Brian was still just a boy, he was a prisoner being transported. The carriage he was in was large and surrounded by soldiers. Those soldiers carry red flags emblazoned with a black crest. Inside the carriage, with him sat several other prisoners. One of them was a middle-aged man. The man asked the boy what crime he had committed to end up here. Brian remained silent. The old man shrugged, saying that if he wanted to, he could keep it to himself. After all, for people captured during a war, things usually end at the gallows anyway, so the charges didn't really matter. Meanwhile, in the cart, the guards riding in the back were complaining to each other. One of them said that with criminals like these, it would be much easier to just execute them on the spot. He didn't understand why they had to go through the trouble of transporting them in the first place. His companion replied that it was all for show. They had to at least pretend there was some kind of process, but the truth was obvious. Most of the people in that cart probably weren't even serious criminals. During the war, there was no time for trials. So they were just rounding people up and dealing with them all at once. Hearing that made the situation feel even more grim. Then, one guard warned the other to be careful. Talking like that could get him into trouble. Unfortunately, they never got to finish that conversation. Suddenly, an arrow tore right through the guard's neck. He sputtered on his own blood, choking. The soldiers immediately shouted that they were under attack. When the cart door, because I was sitting nearby, I saw everything clearly. A blue flag with a yellow rose on it fluttered in the wind. A moment later, several knights in blue cloaks came charging in. They were in full armor, riding powerful horses. The knights in red uniforms were no match for them. The attackers quickly cut them down. After the battle was over, the knights reported to their lord. Pointing to the cart, they asked what should be done with the 3 prisoners. The young knight, on horseback at the front, was the first to speak. He told his father that criminals like them should just be executed on the spot. The middle-aged prisoner trembled in fear. Then, one of the knights slowly approached the cart. Brian looked back at them. The lord asked them what their crime was, and the middle-aged man rushed to explain that they were just thieves. At most, they had only looted corpses on the battlefield. Without warning, the lord cut the man down. Then he glared at the other prisoner. The man froze in shock, and a moment later, he collapsed as well, and Brian simply kept his head bowed. The monarch observed him, saying that at such a young age, he already looked as lifeless as a burnt-out candle. He was just a shell. He asked Brian if he truly had noble to live, and then he asked what his crime was. Brian slowly lifted his gaze to glare at him and said if that was his intention, he should just kill him quickly. He even taunted him, asking if he was scared of killing one little brat for no reason. The knight standing beside the monarch immediately reacted, but the monarch just chuckled, amused, saying this kid had guts. He had taken a liking to him. In fact, he said the boy would be the perfect gift for his youngest daughter. He ordered his men to put the boy in the carriage. The knight, surprised, called out, "Father." Brian was about to become a slave. It was only from what he already believed that his lie was nothing more than trash. But strangely, when he arrived, they allowed him to take a warm bath. And Brian couldn't understand why he was receiving this kind of treatment. Earlier, as soon as he had arrived, the maid had immediately complained that he staying in that state. She refused to let him meet the young lady. She went to him and told him to wash until his skin was practically peeling off. So now, Brian couldn't believe that a slave like him was sitting in a bath. It felt like an absurdly good treatment. He even wondered if this family just had money to burn or something. Then another thought crossed his mind. These people weren't afraid to place a criminal like him near their young lady. They weren't afraid at all. Nevertheless, he couldn't help but wonder what she looked like. The knight next to him warned him not to even think any disrespectful thoughts about the young lady. And if, by any chance, Brian tried any funny business, death would be the least of his worries. He added. To Brian, the night felt unusually noisy. Then, suddenly, someone announced that the young lady was coming. She descended the stairs with calm, elegant steps. And she asked him if he was the person her father had sent as a gift. She asked. Brian looked down at her. As she was quite small, little Mary poked him and said her father had picked him up off the street and that he was shabby and not at all, saying that he looked unrefined. Brian was already starting to get annoyed, but she just gave an infuriating smile and said that since he was a gift from her father, she would cherish him. But Brian maintained a completely indifferent attitude. She then asked what his name was. He answered, Gerard. She commented that it sounded like a very tacky name. And Brian quickly realized that she had a real talent for getting under people's skin. He couldn't believe he had to spend the rest of his life serving this little brat. The thought of it was unbearable. In his mind, he immediately rejected the idea. Then, she suddenly said, Brian. Brian blinked, confused. Then she made it clear that from now on, that would be his name. She held out her small hand to him and said, I'll be in your care. Brian's brow furrowed. In his mind, the name Brian sounded unbelievably tacky. Someone once said that humans are creatures of adaptation. Instead of stealing or robbing on the streets, Brian was now doing housework he had never done before in his life, sending Nana away, stealing to survive what little food there was. Instead of stuffing rotten food scraps into his mouth, he now has warm meals prepared just for him. Instead of people who held grudge against him or came to kill him, people full of kindness and goodwill now approach him. It had only been a few months since he started living like this, but it already felt as comfortable and natural as if he had been living this way from the very beginning. A maid named Linda asked him if he was holding up okay. He replied that he was fine. She studied him for a moment, and then, just as she suspected, she placed her hand on his forehead. You know, with your bangs pushed back, you really do look much better. His face flushed at her words. He quickly turned his head away. What are you doing all of a sudden? However, there was one little problem in his life. Someone suddenly called him in a loud voice. So he went to Mary's room. Mary immediately told him that she wanted something sweet. His biggest problem was this young lady who summoned him whenever she pleased, without any warning. He told her to ask a maid, but she replied that since her mother said she couldn't have any sweets, the maids wouldn't listen to her. He stared at her. She began to pout, puffing out her cheeks. All he could do was let out a sigh. So he brought her some macarons, and that immediately made her happy. She greedily devoured them. Then, she proudly declared that this was exactly what she expected from Brian. Despite such tight security, he had managed to sneak in some sweets. She asked if he used to be some kind of master thief. Brian was no longer the street urchin named Gerard. Now, he was a servant of the house of Set Ilan. Brian. Several years passed. Mary still calls for him. He glanced over at her. very happily announced that her father had returned from his expedition. It was that news Brian had been waiting for. The head of the House of Sedilon, the human, Leslie Sedilon, had returned. His wife, also a human, Catherine Sedilon, welcomed him home. He remarked that it felt good to be home after so long. Mary called out to her father. She ran to him and threw her arms around him. He was delighted to see his daughter. He said she'd grown so much that he almost didn't recognize her, realized what almost happened, and then he saw Brian. And Brian bowed to him. A few men arrived and asked Mary if she was only happy to see their father. She turned to them with a wide smile. She said she was happy to see her older brothers, too. The eldest son of the Chetilon family, Ian Chetilon, remarked that she had grown into quite the young lady. The second son of the Chetilon family, Remel D. Chetilon, teased her for being no bigger than a chestnut. He patted her on the head and asked how she'd been. She whined that he would mess up her hair. Then, Leon patted Brian's shoulder. He thanked him for taking such good care of his little sister, and Brian was touched by the eldest young master's gesture. Since it had been a while since they were all together, the head of the family suggested they share a meal. Everyone gathered in the dining room, and the food was served. Leslie had a seat. Mary looked incredibly happy as she chatted with them. Her older brothers were also enjoying the moment. It was a peaceful scene. Even Brian, who was watching them, found himself smiling. After the meal, the table was cleared. Just then, Leslie approached Brian. He said he wanted to talk for a moment. Brian hadn't expected something like this to happen. Under the moonlight, they shared a few drinks. It had been 5 years since Brian started living there. Leslie asked him if his life had been bearable. Before answering, Brian thought carefully. Then he said it couldn't have been better. Leslie smiled at that answer. He told Brian he looked very different from the man he'd seen 5 years ago, a man who was alive but wished he was dead. Brian said it was all thanks to that person. He gave a dying man a chance to live again and a reason to keep going. Leslie then asked him about that lie, and if he was willing to use it for him. Brian hadn't expected that question at all. While they were talking, several men on horseback approached the mansion. The knights were holding flaming torches. Their commander raised his hand and gave the signal. Their target that night was the mansion. That night, Brian rushed to Mary's room. She woke up from her sleep. At this hour, she asked what he was doing here. In response, he screamed at her to run away immediately. She had absolutely no idea what he was talking about. Meanwhile, outside, Leslie was smiling, but it was clear that he was enraged. He was glaring at a man named Zephyl, the commander of the knights, who had surrounded his house. He was Geoffrey Roots, a human, and the president of the Central Kingdom's Noble Association. He said that this was the only way they could survive. Leo stood by his father's side. Leslie and Leo, along with their guards, were standing outside the mansion gates, and what Geoffrey said only made Leslie even more furious, because Geoffrey was planning to survive by betraying his own master and becoming a dog of the Empire. That was his plan for survival. Geoffrey was taken aback by those words. He respected that Leslie had remained loyal to the very end, but simply replied that not everyone could choose such an honorable death. Meanwhile, Chloe was being dragged away by Bran. They ran as fast as they could. She asked him where they were going. He replied that there was no time to explain. They had to get out of there, right now. It was just before when he was having a drink with Leslie. Leslie warned him that a bloodbath was coming to this place soon, and with that, he entrusted Mary to Brian. Brian had asked, "What about you, my lord?" Leslie simply told him to fulfill his duty, just as he would fulfill his own. In that moment, Leslie had mocked Geoffrey. He told him that he shouldn't have tried to capture him. With just a handful of soldiers, Geoffrey, facing the man known as the strongest in the Central Kingdom, wouldn't have come empty-handed. Leslie's eyes widened. He saw the Zodiac. The creature had a massive, hulking silhouette. It was enormous. Leslie was furious. He screamed that Geoffrey had brought an enemy commander right into the royal capital. A few minutes later, the mansion was in flames. The maids had been stabbed. Ari saw it all. Bodies were strewn across the garden. She stopped in her tracks, just staring blankly. "We have to go now," Brian screamed at her. He grabbed her shoulders. "We don't have time for this. Snap out of it," he shouted. In a trembling voice, Mary asked what on earth was happening. Brian grabbed her by the wrist and dragged her away. He then opened the door and asked Linda if the horses were ready, but to their horror, a man stood there with a knife in his hand. Linda's body lay nearby, covered in blood. The man just watched them. At this point, Linda was already dead. Brian's eyes widened in shock. The man told them they had arrived just in time and that they shouldn't be afraid because it would all be over before they could even feel the pain. But then, someone suddenly lunged at the man, nearly striking him. The attacker landed right in front of them. Clearly, the enemy hadn't expected this person. It was Reynold. His expression was murderously serious. He pointed his sword at the culprit and ordered Brian to take Mary and get out of there. Brian hesitated. He was worried about his young master. Reynold screamed at him to go now. Brian's face twisted in agony. Still, he dragged Mary away as she screamed for her brother. Brian forced himself to keep going. As he dragged her along, Mary cried uncontrollably. She kept looking back for her brother. Meanwhile, their enemy let out an annoyed sigh. He muttered that he was only told to catch a few runts who were getting away. He never expected to have this kind of luck. He thought he recognized Reynold, the second son of House Sachi and the greatest family of knights in the Central Kingdom. He never even dreamed he'd get the chance to face him. Reynold replied that he'd already heard the rumors about a man named Hugo Pagati. At that same moment, a horse was galloping through the night, and on it were Brian and Mary, riding far from the mansion. As they escaped into the forest, Mary was sobbing, unable to stop. Brian was clearly fighting to keep his own emotions in check. For the time being, they had escaped. As the fire roared in the hearth, Brian sat, lost in his thoughts. He kept watch over Mary. Just then, someone from the guild announced that the investigation results were in. It was Alt. He reported that traces of magic had been discovered on the monster's corpses. It was likely the work of a beast tamer. That's what was reported. Ichion, who was on the second floor, as Brian confirmed it. He started to speak. Everyone turned to look at him. They hadn't expected him to show up. Aaron asked what the doctor said, and if Mary was okay. Brian quietly looked at them. Then he called out to Dan and Ariel. He asked them to lend him their strength. In another location, a woman said something was strange. She had already provided a small, monster-alluring poison, and even perfect timing. From her perspective, she had given them everything. This woman was the human, Akunistic Hellas. She asked the man standing before her if he had failed again. The man apologized, explaining that wizard had suddenly interfered. He begged for just one more chance. He was the only survivor. The other culprits had already been cut down, their bodies scattered about. Aquinas decided that she had already given him more than enough chances. Another man searched one of the corpses and pulled something from its pocket. It was a vial filled with a blue liquid. This man was the human, Hugo Pagati, Ars's subordinate. He asked Aquinas if she was really going to use the Siltrok, asked if she was just going to give up. She replied that there was nothing she could do. Now that the surprise attack had failed, security in the territory would be much tighter, and the Hunters Guild would also likely ramp up its investigation. That was a strong possibility. She was worried that if she tried to do anything too direct, the guild would notice her. That was her concern, and more than anything, she didn't want to get on the bad side of Asclepius. After all, this whole thing started from a suggestion she had made as a half-joke. She told Hugo that she would be heading back. Ye Hinjas watched her. He said he would stay since he still had some unfinished business. He watched her leave. And then he muttered that there was something he had failed to resolve a long time ago. He was talking about Mary. Meanwhile, a man was being beaten. His hands were tied, and he was lying face down on the ground. His attacker said that right now, he wasn't in a very patient mood. This line intentionally left like match facing. The attacker was Brian. He warned the man that it would be better to just tell the truth. It would have been better for him. Danny was with him. He was guarding the other men that they had tied up. He looked on edge. Meanwhile, Ariel was just sitting off to the side. She looked like she was asleep. The man who'd just been hit screamed that he didn't know anything. He said he hadn't seen any beast tamers or trolls. Brian didn't believe him. There was no way a guy who knew every single thing that moved in and out of this area could have missed a group of monsters and mages of that size. It just wasn't possible. After all, shaking down guys like this was their specialty. But the man insisted he had no reason to lie. Brian was so furious that he raised his knife, preparing to stab him. The man squeezed his eyes shut and tensed up, but suddenly, someone grabbed Brian's wrist. Brian glared at the person who stopped him. It was Dan. Dan told him that was enough. He reminded Brian that he was only here to help find the antidote for Mary. He had no intention of helping with any murder or torture. Brian ripped his arm away. He snarled that Dan wouldn't have to get his hands dirty, said that wouldn't be necessary. Dan countered that just standing by and watching was no different from murder. Brian fell silent. He slowly composed himself. Then, he told the men he was interrogating to get lost. The men, even though their hands were still tied, quickly fled. Brian turned to Dan and asked if he was satisfied now. He blamed Dan for lowering their chances of finding the beast tamer involved. Dan couldn't believe his ears, but Brian insisted that those men had the antidote. He yelled at Dan that while he was busy acting like a pathetic hypocrite, the young lady was staying. While they were arguing, Ariel remained perfectly still. She was using her magic to focus on something when suddenly she sensed it. She calmly announced that she'd found them. Someone nearby had just used magic. So they hurried through the forest, but Ariel already looked pale and was gasping for air. Looking at her, Dan immediately realized that she had absolutely zero stamina. She had reached her limit. So she told them to go on ahead and asked if it was really that bad. Brian decided to press forward without them. He couldn't believe that he was really leaving. Not a chance. Brian replied that he didn't have a single second to waste. Dane was at a loss for words. He had offered to carry Ariel, but when he turned around, she was gone. As if he had just witnessed the most absurd thing imaginable, Dane's eyes widened, and his face froze in disbelief. Meanwhile, Hugo was sheathing his sword. He remembered what happened 5 years ago. He certainly never expected that the young brat from the station family, the one he failed to kill back then, would be hiding in a place like this. The thought made him smirk. He felt incredibly lucky. Ariel wandered about. She sighed. After realizing she was lost, she knew her terrible sense of direction had struck again. She knew she had to regroup with Dane, and fast. She heard a rustling sound coming from the bushes. Curious, she moved closer to see what it was. In the meantime, the clouds had turned to an ashen gray. Brian pushed his way through the bushes, then froze. The man standing before him was someone he knew all too well. It was Hugo. This time, Hugo had a long scar over his right eye, and the pupil on that side looked strangely pale. Hugo tilted his head, asking Brian if he knew him. He clearly hadn't expected anyone to come looking for him here. Brian's hands were already trembling with rage. He watched as Hero slowly stood up and said it didn't matter. Brian looked around them. Bodies were scattered everywhere. The place was a total bloodbath. He asked Hugo if he was the one who did all of this, if he was the one who ordered the beast tamers to ambush them, massacring everyone who was here. Hugo just glared back at him. Seeing as you, Brian, already look like you're dying to kill me, does it really matter? That was not the answer Brian was expecting, but Hugo didn't care. To be honest, he himself was already in the mood to kill someone. Meanwhile, Day was desperately searching for Ariel. He kept calling out to her. He couldn't believe where she could have disappeared to in that short time. It seemed she had a surprisingly clumsy side to her. He was already worried that Brian had gone off alone. Just that alone was worrisome enough. especially if he had to fight those beast gamers all by himself. It was true. All he could do was frown. He felt this whole mess was turning into one giant headache. In that instant, Brian charged straight at Hugo. Hugo casually sidestepped, dodging the dagger. When Brian swung his other arm to attack him, Hugo ducked under the blow and cut Brian. Blood seeped from the wound. That's when Hugo suddenly remembered him. The servant who was with the little Chargelon kid. His memory was quite sharp. He recalled her being poisoned and knew that Brian had come for the antidote. Hugo pulled out and showed it to him, as if in mockery. Hugo said this was the perfect opportunity. Brian could save the young lady's life and get his revenge at the same time. He asked Brian why he was getting so worked up already, advising him not to rush. Hugo didn't want the little kid to die from poison either. After surviving all that chaos, to then die from a goblin's poison arrow, it was just, he said it would be too boring. Having been mocked like that, Brian charged again. Hugo admitted that while loyalty and courage were commendable, Brian didn't see the mode of place. Brian gripped his daggers tightly, but without even moving his feet. With a single swing of his sword, Hugo knocked one of the daggers right out of Brian's hands. The dagger flew and stuck into the ground. Hugo asked if Brian really believed the hood is win. With such a choice, Brian's hand trembled. Blood dripped from it. Only then did he realize something. He had been so blinded by rage that he had forgotten. He had forgotten for a moment. The former vice-adjutant from the Zodiac, the Empire's strongest order of knights. He had a strange nickname. The Duel Fiend. He'd earned that name because of his fanatical obsession with dueling. His obsession was terrifying. Even on the battlefield, in situations where victory was guaranteed, he would try to settle the outcome with a life or death duel against the enemy commander. And the fact that he was still alive led to the had he ever been defeated? Brian felt completely wild. Hugo asked him, "What's the matter? Where'd all that fight in you go?" he asked. Then, saying he'd give him some motivation, Hugo began to tell a story. He explained that his left eye was injured that day when Reynold de Chatillon stepped forward to protect Brian. That was the day he'd gotten hurt. Reynold was a swordsman from the greatest knightly house in the Central Kingdom, befitting his title. A man of truly extraordinary skill. Hugo said it was a truly magnificent duel. He told Brian he should have seen the look in Reynold's eyes as Hugo's sword pierced his heart, the way the light slowly faded from them. He just had to see it. It was a shame, he said, that he was the only one who got to witness it. Then he laid out his plan. After he killed Brian here, he'd go straight to the village and tell the young lady exactly what happened that day, in vivid, excruciating detail, and after giving her the antidote, he'd challenge her to a duel. He pictured her, filled with rage, that little lady, charging right at him. He said he would carve her up delicately, as if sculpting a work of art. Very, very slowly. And oh, so painfully. He laughed, saying how much fun it was going to be. Brian just said, no. He told Hugo that would never happen. Hugo was going to die right here. In that moment, Brian was filled with rage. Brian lunged at him. He moved with an incredible amount of speed. But Hugo just stood there calmly. Not a care in the world. Brian swung his dagger. Hugo, with a bored expression, dodged the attack, then casually moved his arm, slashing Brian's torso. Blood sprayed into the air. And Brian glanced down at his wound, but immediately pivoted on his foot and tried to throw a punch at Hugo. Hugo swung his sword again, slashing Brian's leg. Blood continued to gush out. Brian looked down at his wounds and then backed away. And he was starting to get pissed off. He asked Hugo what the hell he thought he was doing. Hugo simply repeated the question back to him and answered as if it were obvious. He said he was just making sure his toy didn't break too quickly. Those words made Brian even more furious. He called Hugo crazy, son of a bitch. Hugo told him to calm down. After all, he was starting to lose interest. He had won. He raised his arm and swung his sword. Brian was caught completely off guard. The slash cut across his chest. He coughed up blood. He couldn't understand how an attack from so far away Meanwhile, right in front of Ariel, regretted that he ate. Let him as a footman, dumped him to the ground. She wondered what kind of monster could have left but a huge footprint. She was curious, and the trail led straight. She figured it might be another one of the tower. That's what she thought. Still, the area was guarded, but with Eldred and Hunter. But she thought it would be fine. She hurried off to find Dan. He had a nagging feeling. So she decided to deal with the monster first. Since she'd already lost anyway, Hayes Simakariam mood tusty. And at that very moment, Brian was bleeding. The moonlight is with the lift. Since torturing him, had already got difficult, Hugo decided to end it quickly, obeying lastly. But he had been careless. Despite the power they had, a huge gap, he was well aware of the difference, but he charged in without a plan. Blinded by rage, he was completely acting unlike his usual self. In fact, he knew from the start. Against this monstrous bastard, he didn't stand a chance of winning, and that fact just pissed him off. More than the enemy standing right in front of him, he hated his own pathetic and powerless self. Hugo calmly said his farewells. He said goodbye. But before Hugo could even move his arm, something struck him. It was a pebble. Hugo's face whipped to the side, and Brian looked toward where it had come from. It was Dan who had thrown it. Hugo was in shock. Blood trickled down from his forehead, and his expression twisted with rage. He screamed, demanding to know who Dan was. That was what he was supposed to ask. Dan replied. He asked Hugo who he was, and why he was trying to kill Brian. Brian yelled at Dan to get out of there and run away. Hearing that, Hugo just kicked him again, and Brian was slammed headfirst into the ground. Seeing Brian like that, Dan became worried. Hugo wiped the blood from his forehead. He was furious that they dared to interfere in their so-called sacred duel. He was enraged. They asked him what the hell he was talking about. But before he could say another word, Hugo suddenly moved. He rushed in, aiming to slice Day's neck. Fortunately, at the last second, Day threw his body back, barely managing to dodge the attack. Hugo seemed surprised that he had actually dodged it. Annoyed that the bastard had attacked him out of nowhere, Day got pissed and swung his bat in retaliation. Hugo was stunned. He quickly backed away. He wondered if it was mage, but knew it wasn't. He couldn't believe that such destructive power came from pure physical ability alone. His hands were even trembling. Seeing Hugo coming straight for his head, right from the start, to realize that a peaceful conversation was no longer an option. Hugo noted Dai's bizarre weapon and his absurd strength. He remarked that Brian had made a very interesting friend, and that this was perfect since he was just starting to get bored. With a wicked smile, Hugo wondered what on earth Dai was.